In a remote Nordic settlement where honor means everything, Astrid stands abandoned in the village square, her promised marriage dissolved in front of everyone she knows. The man who was supposed to be her husband has cast her aside like damaged goods, leaving her with nowhere to go and no future to claim. From across the square, Bjorn watches this cruel display with growing anger. He's lived alone for years, content with his solitary life, but something about this public humiliation stirs something deep within him. When tradition demands she be left to fend for herself, Bjorn makes a choice that will change both their lives forever. He steps forward, offering his home to a woman the village has written off. But can two broken souls find healing together, or will the weight of shame and village gossip destroy any chance at happiness they might have found? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The silence stretched across the village square like a blade ready to fall. Astrid's wedding cloak, embroidered with delicate silver threads that had taken her months to complete, hung heavy on her shoulders. Each stitch represented hope, each pattern a dream of the life she thought awaited her. Now it felt like a shroud. Eric's words still echoed in the cold air, "I cannot take a woman who brings shame to our bloodline." The accusation was baseless, born from his mother's poisonous whispers about Astrid's humble origins. But in this moment, truth mattered less than perception. Bjorn felt the iron arm ring on his bicep grow cold against his skin. The warrior's mark had been earned through years of raids and battles, a symbol of honor that now compelled him toward an action that would challenge every custom he'd been raised to respect. His fellow warriors would call him foolish. The village elders would question his judgment. But watching this young woman's dignity stripped away in public stirred something primal in his chest. "Astrid Eriksdottir," he called out, his deep voice cutting through the murmurs of the gathered crowd. Heads turned toward him, eyes wide with surprise. Bjorn rarely spoke at village gatherings, preferring the solitude of his farmstead to the politics of community life. She looked up, her blue eyes bright with unshed tears, but holding a defiance that struck him unexpectedly. Even in humiliation, she stood straight, refusing to cower before those who judged her. "You need shelter," he said, stepping closer. The crowd parted before him, their whispers growing louder. "My hall has room." Elder Gunnar raised his weathered hand. "Bjorn Ironson, consider carefully. This woman has been cast aside for good reason. To take her in defies the natural order." "The natural order," Bjorn replied, his gaze never leaving Astrid's face, "includes protecting those who cannot protect themselves." He extended his hand toward her, noting the slight tremor in her fingers as she considered his offer. "I have nothing to give in return," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind that whipped between the wooden buildings. "I ask for nothing but honest work and respectful conduct under my roof," Bjorn answered. "The choice is yours." Astrid glanced once more at Eric, who stood beside his mother with an expression of righteous satisfaction. 3 years of courtship, of shared conversations by the fjord, of promises whispered under summer skies, all reduced to this moment of public rejection. Her father was dead, her mother remarried to a man who made clear her presence was unwelcome. She had nowhere else to turn. She placed her small hand in Bjorn's calloused palm. "I accept your offer." The crowd erupted in disapproving murmurs, but Bjorn ignored them all. He helped Astrid gather her few possessions, a wooden chest containing her clothes and the tools her mother had given her for weaving, and loaded them onto his cart without ceremony. As they prepared to leave, Elder Gunnar approached. "This decision will bring consequences. Bjorn, the village council will not look favorably upon harboring a woman of questionable virtue." "Astrid's virtue was never in question until today," Bjorn replied evenly, "and my hall is beyond the village boundaries. What I do there concerns no one but myself." The journey to Bjorn's homestead took them along a winding path that followed the curve of the fjord. Neither spoke during the ride, but Astrid found herself stealing glances at her unexpected rescuer. His profile was strong, marked by a scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, a memento from some long-ago battle. His hands held the reins with gentle confidence, and she noticed how he guided the horse around the rougher patches of road, sparing her from unnecessary jolting. The iron arm ring caught the afternoon light, its surface engraved with runes she couldn't read, but which spoke of battles won and honor earned. By offering her shelter, he risked tarnishing that honor in the eyes of their community. The weight of such sacrifice settled heavy in her chest. As they crested a small hill, Bjorn's hall came into view, a sturdy wooden structure surrounded by well-tended fields and outbuildings. Smoke rose from the central hearth, and sheep grazed in the nearby pasture. It was larger than she'd expected, yet somehow felt welcoming rather than imposing. "This is your home now," Bjorn said, as he helped her down from the cart. "For as long as you need it to be." The carved wooden doorbeam caught Astrid's attention immediately as they approached Bjorn's hall. Ancient runes spiraled across the weathered oak, their meaning lost to her, but their purpose clear: protection, welcome, the binding of hospitality that made guests sacred within these walls. Her fingers traced the air near the symbols, not daring to touch something so obviously significant. "My grandfather carved those," Bjorn said, noticing her fascination. He believed words held power when carved in oak and blessed by the gods. The heavy door swung open on well-oiled hinges, revealing a space that surprised her with its warmth and order. The central fire pit glowed with banked coals, ready to spring to life with the addition of fresh wood. Tapestries hung from the walls, their colors muted but still beautiful in the flickering light. The floor was swept clean, and everything had its place. Shields and weapons arranged with military precision, tools hanging from pegs, cooking implements near the hearth. "The sleeping area is behind that partition," Bjorn said, gesturing toward a section of the hall divided by hanging wool. "I've prepared furs there for you." "I sleep near the fire," Astrid nodded, grateful for his consideration, but uncertain about the arrangement. In her father's house, unmarried men and women never shared sleeping quarters, even separated by cloth walls. But then again, her father's house had followed conventions that no longer applied to her circumstances. "Are you hungry?" he asked, moving toward the cooking area with practiced efficiency. "The evening meal won't be elaborate, but there's fresh bread and stew from yesterday." "I can cook," she offered quickly, unwilling to be treated as a guest when she was clearly meant to earn her place. "If you'll show me where things are kept," Bjorn paused, a wooden ladle halfway to the pot hanging over the coals. "You don't need to prove your worth immediately, Astrid. Rest first. Tomorrow we'll establish routines." But she was already moving toward the hearth, her need for useful activity overriding polite restraint. Cooking was familiar, comfortable, something she could control when everything else felt uncertain. She found the bread wrapped in clean linen, the butter stored in a cool corner, herbs hanging in neat bundles from the rafters. As she worked, Bjorn sat at the long wooden table and watched her move around his kitchen. She handled his belongings with respect, returning each item to its proper place after use. Her movements were efficient, graceful even, and he found himself wondering about the life she'd left behind. "Your hall is well maintained," she said, stirring the stew to prevent sticking. "You keep house better than most men. Living alone teaches you quickly," he replied. "Neglect leads to hunger and cold. I learned to value comfort over pride." They ate in companionable silence, the weight of the day's events settling around them like evening fog. Astrid found the stew hearty and well-seasoned, evidence that Bjorn's domestic skills weren't born from mere necessity, but from genuine care for his environment. As darkness gathered outside, the reality of their situation grew more immediate. She would sleep in this stranger's hall, trusting his word that she was safe, depending on his continued goodwill for survival. The carved doorbeam seemed to pulse with protective energy in the firelight, but old wood and ancient runes could only do so much. "Bjorn," she said softly, setting down her wooden spoon, "why did you offer me shelter? Truth, please. not kindness. He considered her question while banking the fire for the night, his movements deliberate and thoughtful. "I watched my wife die 3 winters ago," he finally said. "Fever took her slowly, and I couldn't do anything to help. Standing in that square today, watching Eric destroy you publicly when he could have spoken privately. I suppose I needed to do something useful with my anger. You had a wife." It wasn't a question, but an acknowledgement of grief she hadn't expected to encounter. "Ingrid. We were married 8 years before the sickness came." He hung the fire tools on their hooks with careful precision. "She would have done the same thing I did today, probably with more grace and certainly with less hesitation." Astrid nodded, understanding now that his kindness came not from pity, but from loss transformed into compassion. "I'll try to be worthy of her memory as well as your generosity." "Be worthy of yourself first," Bjorn said. "Everything else follows from that." The partition between their sleeping areas was thick wool, but it felt thin as parchment as Astrid settled into the furs he'd prepared. Every sound seemed amplified: his breathing, the settling of logs in the fire, the wind moving through the eaves. She pulled the furs close and tried to find sleep in this strange new sanctuary. Dawn crept through the smoke hole in the roof, painting the hall in shades of gold and amber. Astrid woke to unfamiliar sounds: the lowing of cattle, the rustle of wind through different trees, the absence of village noises she'd grown accustomed to hearing each morning. For a moment, she lay still, remembering where she was and why. Bjorn was already awake, moving quietly around the main area so as not to disturb her. She could hear him stoking the fire, the soft scrape of wood against stone, the whisper of bellows encouraging flames to life. The courtesy of his silence touched her more than grand gestures might have. Rising carefully, she dressed and emerged from behind the partition to find him preparing to leave for morning chores. He'd left bread and honey on the table, along with fresh milk that was still warm from the cow. "I thought you might prefer to explore the hall while I tend the animals," he said, shouldering a leather satchel. "Make yourself familiar with everything. What's mine is yours to use." After he left, Astrid found herself truly alone in his space for the first time. She moved through the hall slowly, noting details that had escaped her attention the evening before. The weapons on the wall were well maintained, but showed signs of use: nicks and sword blades, worn leather on shield grips. A man who had seen battle but cared for his tools. Near the eastern wall, tucked into an alcove she hadn't noticed in the firelight, stood a loom. Half-finished tapestry stretched across its frame, the pattern incomplete, but clearly the work of skilled hands. The wool was fine quality, dyed in rich blues and greens, worked into a design of intertwining vines and flowers. But dust had gathered on the threads, and spiderwebs stretched between the wooden uprights. Astrid approached the loom as if it were a shrine. The work was beautiful, far more sophisticated than her own simple weaving skills. She could see where the weaver had stopped mid-pattern, the shuttle abandoned beside a basket of coordinated threads. This was not work interrupted by completion or boredom. This was work stopped by death. That was Ingrid's. Bjorn's voice came from behind her. She turned to find him standing in the doorway, having returned sooner than expected. His expression was careful, guarded, as if he'd forgotten the loom was there and regretted her discovery. "She was very skilled," Astrid said softly. "The pattern is unlike anything I've seen in the village." Her mother was from the southern settlements, where they learned different techniques from traveling merchants. He moved closer, his eyes fixed on the unfinished work. "She was working on that when the fever began. Always said she'd finish it when she felt better." The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken grief. Astrid could see now why Bjorn lived alone, why he'd isolated himself from village life. This hall was filled with memories, with the ghost of a woman whose presence still shaped every corner. "I could finish it," she offered carefully, then immediately regretted the presumption. "I mean, if you wanted. I'm not as skilled, but I could follow her pattern." Bjorn's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought she'd overstepped badly. But then his expression softened, and he reached out to touch one of the dusty threads. "She would have liked that," he said finally. Ingrid believed unfinished work held trapped energy, that completion freed the spirit to move on. He looked at Astrid directly. "But only if you want to. Don't feel obligated because I've given you shelter." "I'd be honored," she replied, meaning it, "and it would give me purpose while I learn my place here." They stood together before the loom, two people carrying their own versions of loss and displacement. Astrid saw now that Bjorn's offer of shelter came from understanding what it meant to be left behind, to face an uncertain future alone. His grief was different from her humiliation, but both had carved empty spaces in their lives. She was lucky to have someone who loved her work enough to preserve it, Astrid said. "I couldn't bear to move it," Bjorn admitted. "But I couldn't look at it either." Perhaps this is what she would have wanted. Her pattern completed by hands that understand the value of beautiful things. The morning sun slanted through the hall's windows, illuminating the abandoned loom and the two people who stood before it. In that moment, something shifted between them, not romantic, not yet, but a recognition of shared purpose, of two damaged souls finding unexpected comfort in each other's presence. "Show me how she organized her threads," Astrid said. "I want to honor her method as well as her design." 3 days later, while exploring the area behind Bjorn's hall, Astrid discovered what had once been a thriving herb garden. Now it was overgrown with weeds, the carefully planned beds barely visible beneath tangles of wild growth. But she could see the bones of it, the raised beds built with fitted stones, the pathways designed for easy access. The southern exposure that would catch maximum sunlight, near a weathered wooden post. She found them, a set of gardening tools, wrapped in oiled leather and stored in a small wooden box. The metal showed signs of rust, but was still sound. A hand cultivator, a transplanting spade, pruning shears, and a weeding knife, all sized for smaller hands than Bjorn's, all bearing the patina of frequent careful use. "Those were Ingrid's," Bjorn said, appearing at her shoulder as she examined the tools. He'd grown accustomed to finding her exploring different parts of his property, always respectful but curious about her new environment. She was a healer as well as a weaver. She knew which plants eased fever, which ones helped women through childbirth, which ones kept infection from wounds. His voice carried the pride of a man remembering his wife's accomplishments. "Half the village came here when someone was sick or injured." Astrid ran her fingers along the worn wooden handles, imagining the woman who had used them season after season. "The garden could be restored. The perennials are still there under the weeds. I can see chamomile, comfrey, even some of the more delicate herbs. You know plants? My mother taught me before she remarried." Her new husband thought herb gardens were women's foolishness, superstition disguised as medicine. Astrid stood, testing the weight of the cultivator in her hand. "But during the last fever that swept through our settlement, those same herbs saved 3 children when the healer's prayers failed." Bjorn watched her assess the abandoned garden with the eye of someone who understood both the work involved and the potential rewards. Her practical approach to problems was something he'd noticed over the past few days. She saw situations clearly, without romantic notions about easy solutions. "The work would be considerable," he said. "Those beds haven't been tended in 3 years. I have time, and you've given me shelter. Useful work seems a fair exchange." She knelt and pulled a handful of weeds from what had once been a lavender border. "Besides, working with growing things helps settle an unsettled mind. Then the tools are yours to use." Over the following weeks, Astrid attacked the garden restoration with methodical determination. Each morning, after the household chores were finished, she would take Ingrid's tools and work until the afternoon light began to fade. Bjorn found excuses to pass by during his own tasks, initially to check on her progress, but increasingly because he enjoyed watching her work. She approached the garden the way a scholar might approach an ancient text, carefully uncovering what lay beneath, while preserving anything of value. When she found plants that had survived the neglect, she transplanted them carefully to better locations. When she discovered something diseased or dead, She removed it completely, rather than hoping it might recover. You're rebuilding rather than just cleaning, Bjorn observed one afternoon, finding her dividing a large clump of what he recognized as Ingrid's prized mint. Gardens aren't static, Astrid replied, her hands dark with soil. They grow and change, and sometimes they need to be reimagined rather than simply restored. I'm keeping the structure your wife created, but adapting it for current needs. Her confidence with the plants surprised him. She identified herbs by their scent when the leaves were too damaged to provide visual clues, knew which ones could be divided and which ones preferred to be left undisturbed, understood the relationships between different plants and how they supported or competed with each other. "Where did you learn so much?" he asked, settling on a nearby stone to watch her work. "Necessity, mostly. My mother died when I was 15, and I had to manage the household healing for my father and the farmhands." She paused in her dividing, a shadow crossing her face. "When she remarried, my stepfather made it clear that my knowledge wasn't welcome in his house. Said it made me too independent, too sure of my own worth. Perhaps that's why Eric's mother objected to you," Bjorn said quietly. "Some people fear capability in others because it highlights their own limitations." Astrid looked up at him, soil-stained hands still around the plant she was working with. "Do you think capability makes women difficult to live with?" "I think capability makes women interesting to live with," he replied. "Ingrid certainly never bored me." Market day arrived with the crisp promise of early autumn, and Bjorn announced they needed supplies from the village. Astrid had managed to avoid returning since that first terrible day. But their stores of salt and iron were running low, and the herb garden restoration required tools she couldn't improvise. "Stay close to me," Bjorn said as they approached the market square. "And remember, you have nothing to be ashamed of." But Astrid felt the weight of every stare as they entered the marketplace. Conversation stopped mid-sentence, and she caught fragments of whispered exchanges that followed their passage between the stalls. At Olaf the blacksmith's booth, the bronze scales used for weighing goods seemed to judge her with each transaction, reducing her worth to nothing more than a burden Bjorn had foolishly accepted. 2 pounds of iron stock," Bjorn requested, his voice steady and normal. "And nails if you have them ready-made." Olaf weighed the metal with exaggerated precision, his movements suggesting that Bjorn's presence with Astrid contaminated even business dealings. "That'll be 3 silver pieces. Premium price for premium metal. Last month you charged me 2 silver for the same amount. Prices change." Olaf replied with a shrug that conveyed volumes about his opinion of Bjorn's household arrangements. "Supply and demand, you understand." Bjorn paid without argument, but Astrid noticed how his jaw tightened. At the next stall, the grain merchant's wife turned her back entirely when they approached, forcing them to wait until she finished serving other customers who had arrived after them. "Perhaps I should wait by the cart," Astrid murmured, acutely aware of the hostile attention their presence generated. "You'll do no such thing," Bjorn replied firmly. "You have as much right to be here as anyone." At the cloth merchant's booth, things came to a head. Astrid was examining wool thread for the loom when Sigrid, Eric's mother, materialized beside her with the focused malice of a predator who had found isolated prey. "Still playing house with your charity case, Bjorn?" Sigrid's voice carried clearly across the surrounding stalls. "How long before you tire of feeding and clothing a woman who brings nothing but shame to your name?" "Astrid brings skill and industry to my household," Bjorn replied evenly. "More than can be said for some." "Skill?" Sigrid laughed harshly. "At what? Seducing men into poor decisions? We all know what services she provides to earn her keep." The accusation hung in the air like poison. Several merchants paused their work to listen, and Astrid felt her face burn with humiliation and anger. But before she could respond, Bjorn stepped forward, his full height and warrior's bearing suddenly apparent to everyone watching. "Careful, Sigrid," he said, his voice carrying the quiet menace of controlled fury. "You're speaking of a woman under my protection. Your words reflect more on your character than hers." "Protection," Sigrid spat. "Is that what they're calling it now? Yes, said a new voice from behind them. Elder Gunnar approached, his weathered face grave but not unkind. That's exactly what they're calling it, because that's what it is. Bjorn has offered honorable shelter to someone in need. Perhaps you should consider whether your words honor your own family name. Sigrid's face flushed red, but she couldn't argue with the village elder's rebuke. She gathered her purchases and left without another word, though her departure didn't ease the tension that had settled over the market. The remaining transactions proceeded in uncomfortable silence. Vendors served them correctly but without warmth, charging fair prices but offering no pleasantries. Astrid purchased what she needed for the garden quickly, eager to escape the oppressive atmosphere of judgment and speculation. As they loaded their supplies into the cart, young Kari from the baker's family approached hesitantly. "Astrid, I wanted to thank you for the herbs you sent when my baby had colic. The chamomile tea worked better than anything else we tried." "I'm glad it helped," Astrid replied, surprised by the kindness after an hour of hostility. "Some of us remember that actions matter more than gossip," Kari said loudly enough for nearby listeners to hear. Then she hurried back to her family's stall before anyone could respond. The ride home passed in thoughtful silence, both of them processing the morning's confrontations. As they turned onto the path leading to Bjorn's hall, Astrid finally spoke. "I'm sorry my presence makes life difficult for you." "You make life interesting, not difficult," Bjorn replied. "And anyone who can't see the difference isn't worth worrying about. But the cost of doing right is always worth paying," he interrupted. "My reputation can survive Sigrid's venom. The question is whether you can survive the isolation until people come to their senses." Astrid considered this as they approached the hall, where her herb garden showed signs of emerging order and purpose. "I've survived worse isolation than this," she said finally. "And here at least I have useful work to occupy my time." The harvest season arrived with golden mornings and the urgent need to gather grain before the autumn rains began. Bjorn's fields stretched across several acres, heavy with barley and oats that represented months of careful tending and the difference between comfort and hunger through the long winter ahead. "We'll start with the barley," Bjorn said, handing Astrid a harvest sickle that gleamed in the early light. The curved blade was perfectly balanced, its wooden handle worn smooth by years of use. "The grain is at perfect ripeness. Wait too long and we lose it to weather." Astrid tested the weight of the sickle, adjusting her grip until it felt natural in her hand. She'd helped with harvests before, but never as a full partner in the work. Never with the knowledge that her efforts directly determined her own winter security. They began at the field's eastern edge, working side by side in the methodical rhythm that grain cutting demanded. Cut low, gather the stalks, lay them aside for bundling, each motion flowing into the next until the work became almost meditative. The sun climbed higher, painting the stubbled field behind them in shades of gold and amber. "You've done this before," Bjorn observed, noting how quickly Astrid found her pace. Her strokes were efficient, her gathering neat, her endurance holding steady as the morning progressed. "My father farmed before he took sick," she replied, pausing to wipe sweat from her forehead. "I learned early that everyone works during harvest, regardless of gender or preference." By midday, they had cleared nearly a third of the barley field. They took their meal, sitting on grain bundles, sharing bread and cheese, while watching clouds build on the western horizon. The weather was holding, but both knew that autumn storms could appear quickly and destroy weeks of work in a few hours. "Tell me about your father," Bjorn said, settling more comfortably against a bundle of grain. "You've mentioned him several times, but always briefly." Astrid considered the question while watching a hawk circle high above the field. "He was a good man who made one terrible decision. He married my mother for love, which was unusual in our settlement. When she died, he was lost, not just grieving, but genuinely unable to function without her guidance. He remarried quickly, choosing a woman who came with 2 grown sons and very definite opinions about household management. And your place in that household changed. Completely. My stepmother saw me as competition for resources and influence. My stepbrothers treated me as free labor with no rights or protections. She resumed cutting grain, her movements sharp with remembered anger. When Eric began courting me, my father was relieved. One less mouth to feed, one less complication in his new wife's domain. Yet you agreed to the match. What choice did I have? Astrid's laugh held no humor. A woman alone has few options, and fewer still if she lacks family protection. Eric seemed kind enough, and his family had good standing in the village. I thought it was the best future I could reasonably expect. They worked through the afternoon, in companionable conversation, sharing stories of their past lives and observations about the work at hand. Bjorn found himself watching Astrid more than the grain, noting how she approached each task with focused determination, how she adapted quickly to new challenges, how her presence had begun to feel natural rather than intrusive. As evening approached, they made good progress, despite being only two people tackling work that usually required several families working together. Their teamwork had developed organically, Bjorn cutting ahead while Astrid gathered and bundled. Their movements coordinated, without need for constant communication. "We make a good team," Bjorn said as they secured the last bundles of the day under weighted covers to protect them from dew. "Better than I expected," Astrid agreed, then blushed slightly at the implication of her words. "I mean, I know what you meant." Bjorn's smile was gentle, understanding. "I've been thinking the same thing." As they walked back toward the hall, tools over their shoulders and the day's satisfaction settling around them like comfortable clothing, something fundamental had shifted in their relationship. They were no longer host and grateful guest, no longer protector and protected. They had become partners in the essential work of survival, equals sharing the burdens and rewards of maintaining a life together. That evening, as they sat by the fire reviewing the next day's work, Astrid realized she had laughed more in the past few weeks than in the entire year before her failed wedding. Not from humor alone, but from the simple pleasure of useful work shared with someone who valued her contributions. "Tomorrow we finish the barley and start on the oats," Bjorn said, banking the fire for the night. "Tomorrow," Astrid agreed. The word carrying promises neither of them was quite ready to speak aloud. The storm arrived without warning, on a night when the wind carried the scent of snow from the northern mountains. Astrid woke to thunder that shook the hall's timber frame, and rain lashing against the walls with unusual fury. By morning, it was clear they would be confined indoors for several days, the kind of early winter tempest that made travel dangerous and outdoor work impossible. "The roof is holding well," Bjorn said, checking the areas where heavy rain might find weakness. "We have plenty of firewood and enough food stored. Nothing to do but wait it out." The enforced intimacy of the small space became apparent by the second day. They had grown accustomed to sharing meals and conversations, but now they moved around each other constantly, preparing food, tending the fire, working on indoor tasks. Astrid found herself acutely aware of Bjorn's presence in ways she hadn't noticed when they could escape to separate outdoor activities. She worked on Ingrid's tapestry while he maintained weapons and tools, the familiar rhythm of weaving helping to calm her restless energy. But her sleep was troubled, filled with dreams that left her disoriented and anxious upon waking. On the third night, she woke to her own voice crying out in the darkness. The nightmare had been vivid, standing again in the village square while Eric pronounced her worthless. But this time the entire settlement joined in condemning her, their voices rising like the storm winds outside. "Astrid," Bjorn's voice came softly from beyond the partition. "Are you well?" "Just a dream," she managed, her voice shaky. "I'm sorry I woke you." She heard him rise and move closer to the partition, his presence palpable even through the wool barrier. "The same dream you've been having?" She hadn't realized he'd been aware of her restless nights. "How did you know?" "You talk in your sleep sometimes. Always about the square, about being judged." He paused, seeming to wrestle with some decision. Would it help to talk about it? Without waiting for permission, he moved around the partition and sat on the floor beside her sleeping furs. careful to maintain respectful distance while offering comfort through proximity. In the dim light from the banked fire, she could see genuine concern in his expression. "I dream about that day constantly," she admitted, pulling her furs more tightly around herself. "But in the dreams it gets worse. Everyone I've ever known joins in the condemnation, and I'm left standing there while they list my failures and inadequacies." "Dreams often amplify our fears beyond reality," Bjorn said gently. "What happened to you was cruel, but it doesn't define your worth, doesn't it?" Astrid's hand moved unconsciously to the silver pendant at her throat, Thor's hammer, the only thing of value she owned, given to her by her father before he died. "Sometimes I wonder if Eric was right, if there is something fundamentally wrong with me that makes me unworthy of love or loyalty." Bjorn studied her face in the firelight, noting the tears she was trying to hold back and the way she clutched the pendant like a lifeline. "May I see that?" he asked, gesturing toward the silver hammer. She hesitated, then lifted the chain over her head and placed the pendant in his palm. His fingers closed around it gently, testing its weight and examining the intricate engravings that covered its surface. "This is beautiful work," he said. "Old style but masterfully crafted. Where did it come from?" "My father gave it to me on my 16th birthday. It belonged to his mother and her mother before that. He said it would protect me and remind me that I carry the strength of all the women who wore it before me." Wise words. Bjorn handed the pendant back to her, watching as she replaced it around her neck. "Your father saw something in you worth protecting and honoring. Eric's blindness doesn't erase that truth." They sat in comfortable silence while the storm raged outside, the intimacy of shared vulnerability creating a new kind of closeness between them. Astrid found her breathing gradually steadying, the panic of the nightmare fading under Bjorn's calm presence. "Tell me about Ingrid's pendant," she said softly. "Did she have something similar?" "A silver cross from her mother's Christian beliefs, mixed with our older traditions. She used to say that protection came from many sources, and wise people accepted help wherever they found it." He smiled at the memory. "She would have liked you, I think. You both understand that survival sometimes requires adapting old wisdom to new circumstances. I wish I could have known her. In a way, you do know her. Every day you work in her garden, complete her tapestry, live in the space she helped create. Her influence continues through the kindness you show to those who need healing herbs, through the beauty you're adding to this place." The storm finally began to subside near dawn, but neither moved to return to their separate spaces. They had crossed some invisible boundary during the long night, moving from careful coexistence towards something deeper and more genuine. 2 weeks after the storm, Bjorn was repairing the barn door when the axe slipped on wet wood and bit deep into his left hand. He called out more from surprise than pain, but when Astrid came running from the herb garden, she found blood seeping through his fingers as he pressed them against his palm. "Let me see," she said, her voice immediately shifting into the calm authority she used when dealing with injuries. She guided him to sit on a nearby stump and gently pried his fingers away from the wound. The cut was deep but clean, running across his palm from the base of his thumb toward his wrist. Blood welled steadily from the gash, and Astrid could see it would need careful tending to heal properly and avoid the corruption that claimed so many who suffered similar injuries. "Stay here," she instructed, already moving toward the hall. "Keep pressure on it, but don't look at it if blood makes you queasy." "I've seen worse in battle," Bjorn replied, though his voice carried a slight tremor that suggested the wound was more serious than he wanted to admit. Astrid returned quickly with her healing supplies, clean linen strips, a bone needle she'd inherited from her mother, silk thread strong enough for stitching flesh, and a selection of herbs from the garden she'd been carefully cultivating. She knelt beside him and began cleaning the wound with water heated over the fire and infused with comfrey to reduce inflammation. "This will hurt," she warned, threading the needle with practiced efficiency. But it needs to be closed properly, or you'll lose the use of your hand." As she began the delicate work of drawing the wound closed, Bjorn found himself studying her face, rather than watching the needle pierce his skin. Her concentration was complete, her movements sure and gentle despite the difficult task. There was something almost sacred in her careful attention, in the way she treated his injury, as if healing him was the most important thing in the world. "Where did you learn to stitch so finely?" he asked, partly from genuine curiosity and partly to distract himself from the sharp tugs of thread through skin. "My mother was the settlement's primary healer before she married my father," Astrid replied, not looking up from her work. "She taught me that a crooked stitch in flesh heals crooked, but a straight stitch disappears completely if done with proper care." Her fingers were steady as she worked, each stitch placed with mathematical precision to ensure the edges of the wound would meet cleanly. The silk thread was barely visible against his skin, and Bjorn realized that her sewing skills, evident in her work on Ingrid's tapestry, translated perfectly to the more critical task of mending human flesh. "The bleeding has nearly stopped," she observed with satisfaction. "That's a good sign. Means the cut missed anything vital." As she tied off the final stitch, their faces were close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she used, could see the small scar near her left eyebrow that spoke of some childhood accident. When she looked up to check his expression for signs of excessive pain, their eyes met and held for a moment longer than strictly necessary. "Thank you," he said softly. "I've had battlefield surgeons work with less skill and gentleness. Healing shouldn't add to suffering if it can be avoided," she replied, but her cheeks had colored slightly at the compliment. She began wrapping his hand with clean linen, her touch careful but confident. "Keep this dry for 3 days, then we'll check the stitches. I'll prepare a salve that should prevent corruption and ease the healing." The bandaging required her to hold his hand steady while winding the cloth around his palm and between his fingers. The intimacy of the contact was impossible to ignore, her small hands cradling his much larger one, her thumb occasionally brushing across his knuckles as she worked. Neither spoke during this process, but the air between them seemed charged with awareness. "There," she said finally, securing the bandage with a neat knot. "You should have full use of your hand once it heals, though you'll carry a scar." "Scars tell stories," Bjorn replied, flexing his fingers carefully to test the binding. "This one will remind me that I have someone who cares whether I heal properly." Astrid packed her supplies carefully, using the methodical organization of materials to cover her emotional response to his words. Caring for him had felt natural, necessary, but also intimate in ways that surprised her. She'd touched him more in the past hour than in all their previous weeks together, and the contact had awakened feelings she wasn't sure she was ready to acknowledge. "I should prepare that salve," she said, rising to return to the hall. "Astrid." She turned back to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I'm grateful for more than just your healing skills," she nodded, understanding the deeper meaning in his words, and walked back toward the herb garden, where she could gather her thoughts along with the plants she needed for his care. The ancient marriage cup sat on the table between them, its carved surface catching the firelight like captured memories. Bjorn had brought it out from the wooden chest where it had waited through 3 years of solitude, the ceremonial drinking horn that had bound his family's marriages for generations beyond counting. "This belonged to my great-grandfather," he said, running his finger along the intricate knotwork that spiraled around the horn's rim. "And his great-grandfather before him. It's been part of every wedding ceremony in my family for longer than our stories remember." Astrid stared at the cup, understanding immediately why he had brought it into the light. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she processed what his words implied. What question hung unspoken in the air between them? "Bjorn," she began, then found herself unable to continue. "I know this is sudden," he said gently. "I know we've shared this roof for only a few months, and that your last experience with marriage ended in pain and humiliation. But I also know that what's grown between us is real and worth honoring properly." She touched the silver pendant at her throat, drawing strength from its familiar weight. "Are you asking because you feel obligated? Because the village expects it? Or because—" "I'm asking because I love you," he interrupted, his voice steady and sure. "Not from duty or convenience or because you've proven useful around the household. I love your intelligence, your strength, the way you bring healing to everything you touch. I love how you've honored Ingrid's memory while making this place yours as well as mine." Tears gathered in Astrid's eyes, but she didn't look away from his face. "How can you be certain? How do you know this isn't just gratitude or loneliness or—" "Because I lived 8 years with Ingrid," Bjorn replied. "I know the difference between affection and love, between companionship and partnership. What I feel for you honors what I felt for her without diminishing either." The marriage cup seemed to pulse with significance in the firelight, its ancient wood polished smooth by countless celebrations, countless promises spoken over its rim. Astrid could almost see the ghosts of all the couples who had drunk from it, sealing bonds that had lasted through seasons of plenty and scarcity, joy and sorrow. "The village will say you're making another foolish choice," she said softly. "Taking in the abandoned woman was charity, but marrying her will be seen as weakness or poor judgment. The village can think what it chooses," Bjorn said firmly. "We've proven we can build a good life together regardless of their opinions. Our marriage would be for us, not for them." Astrid rose and walked to the window, looking out at the land they had worked together through harvest and storm. The herb garden was dormant now under winter's grip, but she could see its promise of spring renewal, of cycles that continued regardless of human uncertainty. "I'm afraid," she admitted, still facing away from him. "Not of you, but of hope itself. When Eric rejected me, it wasn't just humiliation. It was the shattering of every assumption I'd made about my future, about my worth. I don't know if I can survive another disappointment of that magnitude." Bjorn joined her at the window, close enough to offer comfort, but not touching. "I can't promise we'll never face difficulties or disagreements, but I can promise that I will never humiliate you publicly or privately. Never cast you aside when circumstances become challenging. Never make you question your fundamental worth as a person." She turned to face him, seeing in his expression the same steadiness that had drawn her to accept his original offer of shelter. He was not a man given to grand gestures or flowery speeches, but his word, once given, held the weight of bedrock. "If I say yes," she said carefully, "it can't be a hasty ceremony that we might later regret. I need time to be certain, and you deserve a wife who chooses you from love, not gratitude or desperation." "How much time?" "Spring," she said, the word coming from some deep instinct she didn't fully understand. "Let us get through the winter together, see how we fare when tested by cold and isolation and the daily challenges of survival. If what we feel is real, it will grow stronger rather than weaker under pressure." Bjorn nodded slowly, understanding the wisdom in her caution. "And if you decide yes in the spring?" Astrid looked again at the marriage cup, imagining herself drinking from it as countless generations of women had done before her, sealing a bond built on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than family obligation or economic necessity. "Then we'll drink from your family's cup," she said, "and I'll become your wife not because I have no other choice, but because I cannot imagine a better one." Bjorn carefully wrapped the ceremonial horn in soft cloth and returned it to its chest. But its presence had changed something fundamental in their relationship. The possibility of marriage now existed between them, spoken and acknowledged, waiting for spring's warmth to either flourish or fade. Spring arrived with the gentle persistence of melting snow and the first green shoots pushing through winter's debris. True to her word, Astrid had spent the cold months observing her feelings toward Bjorn, testing whether proximity bred contentment or irritation, whether shared hardships strengthened or strained their bond. The answer had become clear long before the final frost disappeared. Yes, she told him on a morning when the herb garden showed its first signs of renewed life. My answer is yes. Bjorn's smile transformed his entire face, erasing years of solitary grief and replacing it with joy so pure it made Astrid's heart skip. He lifted her from the ground and spun her around, both of them laughing like children freed from winter's confinement. But even as they celebrated their decision, practical concerns demanded attention. They would need witnesses, someone to perform the ceremony, and preparations that honored both tradition and their unique circumstances. I want something simple, Astrid said as they discussed arrangements. Not because I'm ashamed, but because I want the focus to be on our promises to each other, not on impressing people who've already formed their opinions about us. Agreed, Bjorn replied. Though we should invite Elder Gunnar and a few neighbors who've shown us kindness. Kari from the baker's family, perhaps, and old Magnus, who helped with the harvest. The wedding crown became Astrid's primary concern as the ceremony date approached. Traditional brides wore elaborate headdresses of silver and gold, passed down through family lines or commissioned from skilled metalworkers. But Astrid possessed neither inherited finery nor the means to purchase new ornaments. I could ask to borrow something, she mused, sitting before Ingrid's mirror as she brushed her hair. Surely someone in the village has pieces they might lend. Or, Bjorn said thoughtfully, we could create something new, something that belongs to us, rather than carrying the weight of other people's expectations. They spent several evenings designing a crown that would reflect both beauty and practicality. Bjorn proved surprisingly skilled at working silver wire, bending it into delicate spirals that would hold small flowers and herbs from Astrid's garden. The result was a circlet that was modest but elegant, modern yet timeless. It's perfect, Astrid said when he presented the finished piece. The silver gleamed softly in the firelight, its simple lines enhanced by the promise of living decoration. It looks like something that grew rather than something that was made. The crown's design allowed for seasonal adaptation. Spring flowers for their wedding, summer herbs during festival days, autumn berries for harvest celebrations. It would change with the cycles of their life together, always beautiful but never static. 3 days before the ceremony, unexpected guests arrived. Astrid's stepbrother Harold appeared at their door, travel-worn and uncomfortable, carrying news from her former home. Father is dead, he announced without preamble. Died in his sleep 2 months ago. Stepmother sent me to tell you, though she made it clear you're not welcome at the funeral rites. Astrid absorbed this information with surprising calm. Her relationship with her father had been damaged by his remarriage, but his death still marked the end of her last family connection. I'm sorry for your loss, Bjorn said formally, offering Harold hospitality despite the obvious tension. There's more, Harold continued, shifting uncomfortably. Father left you something in his final words. Said to tell you that he was proud of the strength you showed, that you'd proven yourself worthy of the pendant he gave you. The silver Thor's hammer seemed to grow warm against Astrid's chest. Even in death, her father had found a way to offer the approval and recognition she'd craved during his lifetime. Will you stay for the wedding? She asked, surprising herself with the invitation. Harold glanced around the well-maintained hall, noting the signs of prosperity and contentment. You're really going through with this? Marrying the man who took you in like a stray animal? I'm marrying the man who saw my worth when others chose blindness, Astrid replied firmly. The man who offered partnership when the world offered only judgment. Then I suppose I'll stay, Harold said grudgingly. Someone from the family should witness it, and stepmother would be furious if she knew I'd missed an opportunity to see whether you've truly landed on your feet. The wedding crown sat on the table between them, catching afternoon light and casting small rainbows across the wooden surface. In 3 days, Astrid would wear it as she spoke vows that would transform her from refugee to wife, from burden to partner, from someone defined by abandonment to someone celebrated for her choice to love again. It's going to be a beautiful ceremony, she said. More to herself than to either man. It's going to be a new beginning, Bjorn corrected gently. And she knew he was right. The morning of their wedding dawned clear and warm, with spring sunlight streaming through the hall's windows like a blessing from the gods themselves. Astrid woke before sunrise, her stomach fluttering with nervous excitement, and found Bjorn already awake, staring at the ceiling with an expression of peaceful anticipation. Second thoughts, she whispered across the space between their sleeping areas. Only about whether I deserve such happiness, he replied softly. You? Only about whether I'm brave enough to accept it. They rose and began the careful preparations that would transform an ordinary day into the beginning of their married life. Bjorn had arranged for Elder Gunnar to perform the ceremony at midday, with a small group of carefully chosen witnesses. Nothing elaborate, nothing designed to prove anything to anyone except themselves. Astrid bathed with special care, using the lavender soap she'd made from her herb garden and washing her hair with rainwater she'd collected for its softness, as she dressed in her finest gown, blue wool embroidered with silver thread that matched her wedding crown. She felt herself transforming from woman in residence to bride, preparing for her chosen future. The shared mead horn sat ready on the table, polished to gleaming perfection and filled with honey wine that Bjorn had been aging since before Ingrid's death. The ancient vessel seemed to pulse with accumulated significance, as if all the successful marriages it had witnessed had imbued it with the power to bless new unions. "Are you ready?" Bjorn asked, offering her his arm. He wore his finest tunic, dark green wool with silver clasps, and his iron arm-ring caught the light as he moved. The warrior's mark that had once represented his willingness to risk honor for principle now symbolized the strength he brought to their partnership. The guests began arriving at mid-morning. Kari from the baker's family brought fresh bread shaped into traditional wedding knots. Old Magnus carried a small carved wooden bowl as a gift for their household. Even Harold, despite his initial reluctance, had remained to witness his stepsister's marriage and seemed genuinely moved by the obvious affection between bride and groom. Elder Gunnar arrived precisely at midday, carrying the ceremonial staff that marked his authority to bind couples in marriage. His expression was solemn but warm as he surveyed the modest gathering. "We are here," he began, his voice carrying the weight of countless ceremonies performed over his long life, to witness the joining of Bjorn Ironson and Astrid Eriksdotter in marriage. They come to this union not from obligation or convenience, but from choice freely made and affection freely given. The vows they spoke were traditional in structure, but personal in content. Bjorn promised to provide protection, partnership and respect for Astrid's wisdom and independence. Astrid promised loyalty, honesty, and the sharing of both burdens and joys. Their words rang clearly through the hall, witnessed by friends who had seen their relationship develop from awkward charity to genuine love. "Bring forth the marriage cup," Elder Gunnar instructed. Bjorn lifted the ancient horn, its carved surface warm from his hands and bright with reflected sunlight. He raised it toward the assembled witnesses, then offered it first to Astrid. "With this cup I bind my life to yours," he said formally. "What joy comes to you comes to me. What sorrow touches you touches me. We are no longer two people sharing a roof, but one family sharing a future." Astrid accepted the horn with hands that trembled slightly, whether from emotion or the weight of tradition, she couldn't say. The mead was sweet and strong, warming her throat as she drank. But more than the honey wine, she tasted promise, commitment, the flavors of a life chosen rather than endured. "With this cup I bind my life to yours," she repeated, then passed the horn back to Bjorn. "Your victories are my victories. Your defeats are my defeats. We face whatever comes as partners, equals, husband and wife." Bjorn drank deeply, then raised the horn toward the rafters in salute to whatever gods might be watching. When he lowered it, his eyes found Astrid's, and she saw in them the same mixture of joy and solemnity that filled her own heart. "By the authority given me by this community and blessed by the gods of our ancestors," Elder Gunnar declared, I pronounce you married. May your union prosper, may your children be strong, and may you find in each other the companion your souls require. The kiss that sealed their marriage was gentle, reverent, full of promise for the intimate moments that would follow. Around them, their small gathering erupted in cheers and congratulations. But Astrid heard only the sound of her heart settling into its new rhythm, no longer solitary, no longer defensive, but part of a harmony created by two lives choosing to become one. The carved marriage chest sat in the corner of what was now truly their shared chamber, its fresh wood scented with cedar and decorated with Bjorn's careful knotwork designs. He had spent weeks crafting it in secret, working by lamplight after Astrid had gone to sleep, creating something that would mark her transition from guest to wife. From temporary resident to permanent partner, you made this for me, she asked on their first morning as husband and wife, running her fingers along the intricate patterns that spiraled across the lid. Each curve and intersection had been carved with meticulous care, creating a design that was both beautiful and deeply personal. For us, Bjorn corrected, lifting the heavy lid to reveal the spacious interior lined with soft wool. Your belongings deserve a proper place, not just temporary storage in borrowed corners. The chest was large enough to hold her clothes, the few pieces of jewelry she possessed, the healing herbs she kept for personal use, and the small treasures that made a space feel like home. But more than its practical function, it represented permanence, the understanding that this was no longer a temporary arrangement subject to change with circumstances or whim. Astrid carefully transferred her possessions from the simple wooden box she'd carried from her father's house. Each item seemed to gain significance as she placed it in the marriage chest, the silver pendant that connected her to generations of strong women, the bone needle and silk thread that had sewn Bjorn's wounded hand, the few coins she'd saved from selling herbs to village women who sought her healing skills despite social disapproval. "There's something else," Bjorn said, reaching into his own clothing chest and withdrawing a small wrapped bundle, a wedding gift, though perhaps not what you might expect. Inside the cloth wrapping lay a set of iron keys, their metal bright with recent forging and their design matching the locks on the hall's various storage areas. The largest key fit the main door, while smaller ones opened the grain stores, the root cellar, and the locked box where they kept their silver and other valuables. "The keys to our household," Astrid said, understanding immediately what the gift represented. "Full partnership in everything we've built together, and everything we'll build in the future," Bjorn agreed. "No corners of our life together are closed to you. No decisions made without your voice. No responsibilities that aren't shared." The weight of the keys in her palm felt substantial, significant beyond their mere metal. In her father's house, she had never been trusted with keys to anything important. During her brief engagement to Eric, his mother had made clear that a daughter-in-law would earn such trust slowly, if at all. But Bjorn offered complete access from the moment their vows were spoken. She added the keys to the marriage chest, arranging them carefully beside her other treasures. The chest was beginning to fill with the artifacts of their shared life, practical items mixed with sentimental ones, creating a collection that told the story of their unlikely courtship and marriage. "I have something for you as well," she said, reaching into the small pouch she'd kept hidden since accepting his proposal. "Though it's not something I made." The object she placed in his hands was a smooth river stone, dark grey with veins of white quartz running through its surface. It fit perfectly in his palm, worn smooth by years of handling. "My mother gave this to me when I was very young," Astrid explained. "She said it came from the river near where she and my father first met, and that it had absorbed some of the happiness of that day. She told me to keep it safe and give it to someone whose happiness became as important to me as my own." Bjorn turned the stone over in his hands, feeling its weight and warmth. "It's beautiful, but are you certain you want to part with it?" "I'm not parting with it," Astrid replied. "I'm sharing it. The way my mother shared her happiness with my father. The way I want to share mine with you." They spent the morning organizing their combined belongings, creating shared spaces where once there had been careful separation between his possessions and hers. The marriage chest became the centerpiece of this integration, a physical manifestation of lives joining rather than merely coexisting. As Astrid arranged her herbs alongside Bjorn's tools, her weaving materials beside his weapon maintenance supplies, she felt the last vestiges of uncertainty fade away. This was her home now, not by sufferance or charity, but by right and choice. The carved patterns on the marriage chest caught the afternoon light, their intertwining designs a perfect metaphor for the complexity and beauty of two lives becoming one. "We should add something each year," she suggested, closing the lid with a satisfying sense of completion. A small reminder of the year's joys and challenges, so that someday we can look through this chest and remember our entire life together. "Beginning now," Bjorn agreed, "with the stone that represents the foundation of our happiness." Winter returned with fierce determination, bringing storms that lasted for days and cold that seemed to seep through stone and timber alike. But this winter felt different from the one that had tested their friendship. Now they faced the long, dark months as husband and wife, their intimacy deepened by marriage vows and the complete sharing of domestic life. The warming stones became part of their nightly ritual. These smooth river rocks heated by the fire and wrapped in wool to carry heat to their bed through the coldest hours. Bjorn had learned the technique from his grandmother, who claimed that shared warmth strengthened marriage bonds as surely as shared hardships. "Careful, this one's particularly hot," Astrid warned, wrapping one of the larger stones in soft sheep's wool before tucking it near their feet. The bed they now shared had been built for two, with thick furs and woven blankets that created a warm cocoon against winter's assault. "Do you remember?" Bjorn said, settling beside her as the stones began to radiate their captured heat. "That first storm when you woke from nightmares and couldn't return to sleep. When I was terrified that accepting your help was just another mistake waiting to reveal itself," Astrid replied, snuggling closer to his warmth. "I spent that whole night expecting you to change your mind about offering shelter, to decide I was more trouble than I was worth. And now I know that some troubles are worth the complications they bring." She traced patterns on his chest in the firelight that flickered through their chamber. "Though I still sometimes wonder what would have happened if you hadn't stepped forward that day in the village square." "Someone else would have eventually," Bjorn said with quiet certainty. "You're too valuable to stay discarded for long. But I'm grateful I was the one who recognized it first." The warming stones pulsed with gentle heat between them, making the bed feel like a safe harbor, while wind howled around the hall's walls. Outside, snow was falling steadily, adding to drifts that already reached the lower windowsills. They were effectively isolated from the rest of the world, dependent entirely on their stored food and each other's company. "Tell me about the worst winter you remember," Astrid requested, a game they'd developed during the long, dark evenings. Sharing stories of past hardships somehow made current challenges feel more manageable. "The year Ingrid died," Bjorn said without hesitation. "Not because the weather was particularly harsh, but because I had to face it alone for the first time. I discovered that physical cold is nothing compared to the cold of an empty house, empty conversations, empty beds." Astrid understood that kind of cold. She'd experienced it in her father's house after his remarriage, surrounded by people who treated her presence as an unwelcome obligation. "And the best winter?" "This one," he replied, pulling her closer so she could feel his heartbeat steady beneath her ear. "Even with the storms and the isolation, even with the extra work of maintaining everything ourselves. This is the winter I learned that shared hardship creates stronger bonds than easy comfort ever could." They lay in comfortable silence, listening to the wind and feeling grateful for their warm sanctuary. The warming stones gradually cooled, but their bodies generated enough heat to maintain comfort through the night. Astrid found herself marveling at the simple pleasure of falling asleep beside someone who wanted her there, who chose her presence over solitude. "Bjorn," she said softly, just before sleep claimed her. When spring comes and the baby is born, will you teach them about the warming stones? About all the small traditions that make a house feel like home?" He was quiet for so long that she wondered if he'd fallen asleep, but then his arms tightened around her slightly. "Baby? I think so. I'm not completely certain yet, but yes, I think we're going to have a child." The warming stones seemed to pulse with extra heat at her words, as if the very earth approved of new life growing in the midst of winter's dormancy. Bjorn's hand moved to rest gently on her still flat stomach, his touch reverent and protective. "Are you happy about it?" she asked, suddenly uncertain despite their marriage vows and declarations of love. "Happy doesn't begin to cover what I'm feeling," he whispered against her hair. Grateful, amazed, terrified, excited, all at once. "When did you begin to suspect?" "A few weeks ago. I wanted to be certain before I told you." She covered his hand with hers, pressing it more firmly against the place where their child was growing. "Are you worried about becoming a father again, after losing—" "Every parent worries," he interrupted gently. "But worry mixed with joy is better than either emotion alone. We'll face whatever comes together, just as we've faced everything else." The warming stones cooled completely as they slept, but their shared warmth carried them through until morning, when they would begin planning for the new life that would join their family come spring. Spring's arrival brought more than just melting snow and longer days. It brought visible proof of the new life growing within Astrid. Her pregnancy had progressed through winter's isolation with remarkable ease. And now, as she tended the herb garden that was awakening from its cold sleep, her condition was unmistakable to any observer. The first seedlings pushed through the soil with determined optimism, their tender green leaves a promise of abundance to come. Astrid knelt carefully between the raised beds, her movements adapted to accommodate her changing body, and transplanted the delicate shoots with practiced precision. "Look," she called to Bjorn, who was repairing winter damage to the barn roof. "The chamomile survived after all. I thought the hard freeze in February had killed it completely." He climbed down from his work to examine the tiny plants she'd uncovered. Ingrid always said chamomile was too stubborn to die easily. He said it was like certain people she knew. The more life tried to discourage them, the more determined they became to flourish. The comparison made Astrid smile. She had indeed proven more resilient than anyone, including herself, had expected. The woman who had stood abandoned in the village square less than 2 years ago was now a respected wife, skilled healer, and expectant mother. Her transformation had been gradual but undeniable. "These will be ready for harvesting by midsummer," she said, carefully firming soil around the transplanted seedlings. "Perfect timing for when the baby arrives, and we'll need soothing teas for both mother and child." The herb garden had expanded significantly under her care, now containing dozens of varieties that served both culinary and medicinal purposes. She'd added plants for women's health, children's ailments, and general household remedies, creating a living pharmacy that drew visitors from throughout the settlement. Word of her pregnancy had spread through the village with the speed that only significant news could achieve in a small community. Reactions varied. Some neighbors expressed genuine happiness for the couple, while others muttered about bastard children and hasty marriages. But Astrid found she cared less about public opinion, now that she carried physical proof of her and Bjorn's love. "Astrid," a voice called from the garden's entrance. She looked up to see Carrie approaching, her own toddler clinging to her skirts and her arms full of what appeared to be baby clothes. "Carrie, what a pleasant surprise." Astrid rose carefully, brushing soil from her hands. "What brings you here so early in the morning?" "These," Carrie said, setting down her bundle and revealing an assortment of tiny garments. "My children have outgrown them, and I thought you might find them useful. They're not fancy, but they're warm and well-made." Astrid lifted one of the small tunics, marveling at its miniature perfection. The wool was soft from many washings, and the seams showed careful mending where active children had tested the limits of fabric and thread. "This is incredibly generous," she said, unexpected tears gathering in her eyes. Pregnancy had made her emotions more volatile, but this gesture touched something deeper than hormonal sensitivity. "It's what neighbors do," Carrie replied simply. "Besides, you've helped half the village with your healing herbs. Time we returned some of that kindness." As they sorted through the baby clothes together, Astrid realized that community acceptance was finally shifting in her favor. Not universal approval, that might never come, but enough support to make raising a child in this place feel possible rather than daunting. "Have you chosen names?" Carrie asked, holding up a tiny cap knitted in soft yellow wool. "We've discussed possibilities," Astrid replied. "For a boy, perhaps Magnus after Bjorn's grandfather. For a girl, we're thinking Inga, though not after anyone in particular. We just like the strength of the sound." "Both good names," Kari agreed. "Names that will serve well regardless of what path the child chooses." After Kari left, Astrid sat among her seedlings and baby clothes, overwhelmed by the sudden understanding that she was creating more than just a garden or a family. She was building a legacy, knowledge and traditions, and love that would extend beyond her own lifetime, through the child she carried and the community connections. She was gradually rebuilding the seedlings. Around her seemed to pulse with shared determination, each tiny plant representing possibility and renewal. By autumn, this garden would provide healing for dozens of people. By winter, her child would be walking among these same beds, learning the names and properties of plants that could cure and comfort. "Growing strong?" Bjorn asked, returning from his roof repairs to find her surrounded by green abundance. "Everything is growing strong," she replied, one hand resting on her expanding belly, while the other touched the soil that nurtured both plants and dreams. "Everything is exactly as it should be." The tattered travel cloak appeared at their doorstep on a morning when summer rain drummed steadily against the hall's roof. Astrid, now heavy with child and moving slowly, answered the knock to find Eric standing in their doorway, his clothing worn from long travel and his face bearing the marks of months spent in hard conditions. "Eric." The name left her lips with no emotion, neither welcome nor hostility, just recognition of an unwelcome complication. "Astrid." His eyes moved immediately to her obvious pregnancy, and she saw surprise, pain, and something that might have been regret flicker across his features. "I've come to speak with you. Both of you." Bjorn appeared behind her, his hand settling protectively on her shoulder. "Eric, what brings you to our home?" "May I come in? I've traveled far, and what I have to say deserves privacy." Against her better judgment, Astrid stepped aside to allow him entry. Eric's travel cloak dripped water onto their clean floor, and she noticed how the once fine wool had been patched and mended multiple times. Whatever journey had brought him here had been neither comfortable nor prosperous. "Sit," Bjorn said curtly, gesturing toward the bench near the fire. Astrid shouldn't be standing long in her condition. Eric's eyes lingered on her rounded belly as she settled into her chair, and she saw him calculating time, understanding that the child she carried had been conceived in love and security, rather than desperation or accident. "I've made a grave error," Eric began without preamble. "The worst mistake of my life, and I've come to ask, to beg, for your forgiveness and a chance to make things right." "Make what right?" Astrid asked, her voice carefully neutral despite the anger building in her chest. "Our engagement, our future together. Everything I threw away because I was weak and listened to my mother's poison instead of my own heart." Eric leaned forward, his expression earnest and desperate. "I've spent these months traveling, thinking, realizing what a fool I was to let you go." The silence that followed his words was broken only by rain against the windows and the soft crackle of the fire. Astrid felt Bjorn's tension radiating from where he stood behind her chair, his hand still resting on her shoulder like an anchor in a sudden storm. "You want to renew our engagement?" she asked carefully. After publicly humiliating me, after abandoning me in the village square, after forcing me to depend on the charity of strangers? I was wrong, Eric said, his voice breaking slightly. Completely, utterly wrong. My mother filled my head with doubts about your family's status, about whether you'd make a suitable wife for someone of my position. But I've learned that position means nothing without honor. That status is worthless if it costs you the one person who truly matters. Bjorn's hand tightened on Astrid's shoulder. But he remained silent, allowing her to respond in her own way and time. And you think, Astrid said slowly, that you can simply appear here, apologize and reclaim what you discarded? I know it's not that simple, Eric replied quickly. I know I've caused you pain and embarrassment. But I'm prepared to make amends, to provide for you and... His eyes moved again to her pregnancy. To accept the child as my own, if you'll have me back. The offer hung in the air like a poisonous cloud. Astrid felt her baby move within her, as if reacting to the tension in the room, and the movement reminded her of everything Eric's proposal would require her to abandon. You would accept another man's child? She asked, her voice dangerously quiet. If it means having you back, yes. I've learned to value what matters, Astrid. Your worth doesn't decrease because of choices you made after I failed you. Choices I made, Astrid repeated, rising slowly from her chair despite her unwieldy condition. As if my marriage to Bjorn was some desperate response to abandonment, rather than a deliberate choice to love. Someone who valued me from the beginning. Astrid. No. Her voice cut through his attempted explanation like a blade. You don't understand anything. You think this child is some inconvenience you'd magnanimously overlook, some evidence of my fall from grace that you'd generously forgive. But this child represents joy, Eric, love freely given and gratefully received. Everything you proved incapable of providing. Eric's face crumpled as he began to understand that his grand gesture of forgiveness was being rejected not from wounded pride, but from genuine contentment with her current life. I love my husband, Astrid continued, her hand moving to rest on her belly. I love the life we've built together, the respect he shows my intelligence, the partnership we've created. You're not offering me redemption, Eric. You're asking me to trade happiness for the illusion of respectability. The tattered cloak seemed to shrink around Eric's shoulders as the futility of his mission became apparent. He had come prepared to rescue her, only to discover she needed no rescuing at all. The feast bowl arrived on a crisp autumn morning, carried by a delegation of village women led by Elder Gunner's wife, Solveig. The massive wooden vessel was carved from a single piece of oak and polished to a warm honey color, its rim decorated with intricate knotwork that spoke of master craftsmanship and significant expense. For the harvest celebration, Solveig announced, setting the bowl carefully on Astrid and Bjorn's table. The village council voted unanimously. Your household should host this year's feast. Astrid stared at the beautiful bowl, understanding immediately what this gesture represented. The harvest feast was the settlement's most important community gathering, and hosting it was both an honor and a responsibility reserved for families of unquestioned standing. We're honored, Bjorn said carefully, but surely there are others better suited. There are none better suited, interrupted Magna, the blacksmith's wife who had once refused to serve them at market. Your wife delivered my grandson safely when the midwife was away, and her herbs saved 3 children during the summer fever. The bowl belongs where it will be filled with gratitude as well as food. The weeks that followed transformed their homestead into a center of community activity. Neighbors, who had previously maintained polite distance, now arrived daily with contributions to the feast preparation. Old Magnus brought his famous honey cakes, their recipe a closely guarded family secret he'd never shared before. Kari organized the younger women in preserving late autumn fruits, their laughter filling Astrid's kitchen as they worked. I can't believe how much everything has changed, Astrid mused to Bjorn as they surveyed the abundance gathering in their storage areas. Her pregnancy was now so advanced that she moved carefully, but her spirits were higher than they'd been since her father's death. People see what they want to see, Bjorn replied, arranging benches borrowed from half the village around their expanded dining area. When you first arrived, they saw a discarded woman who might be a burden. Now they see a skilled healer, a good neighbor, and the keeper of knowledge they need. The feast bowl sat prominently at the head table, waiting to be filled with the ceremonial first course that would mark the beginning of harvest celebration. Astrid had spent days planning the meal, consulting with experienced cooks and incorporating traditions from her mother's family alongside local customs. 2 days before the feast, young Oscar, the miller's son, fell from a grain wagon and broke his arm badly. The bone pierced through skin, and infection seemed inevitable until Astrid arrived with her healing supplies and knowledge of wound care. She worked for hours cleaning and setting the break, then stayed through the night to monitor for fever and complications. By morning, it was clear the boy would recover completely, his arm healing straight and strong. Word of this success spread through the village like summer fire, cementing Astrid's reputation as more than just a competent herb woman. She was now recognized as a true healer whose skills rivaled those of practitioners from much larger settlements. The feast bowl was well chosen, Elder Gunnar told Bjorn, as they reviewed final preparations. Your wife has earned the community's respect through deed rather than birth, and that's worth more than any inherited status. The morning of the feast dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crystalline air that made colors seem more vivid and sounds carry farther. Families began arriving before midday, carrying covered dishes and wearing their finest clothes. Children ran between the adults, excited by the break from routine and the promise of special foods. Astrid moved through the preparations with calm efficiency, despite her advanced pregnancy, directing the arrangement of dishes and ensuring that every guest felt welcome. The feast bowl was filled first, with barley porridge cooked with honey and enriched with nuts from the forest, a dish that symbolized abundance and gratitude for harvest blessings. Before we begin, Elder Gunnar announced when all were gathered, let us acknowledge our hosts. Bjorn Ironsson and Astrid Bjornsdottir have opened their home and their hearts to this community. They have proven that honor comes from action, not ancestry, and that the bonds we choose can be stronger than those we inherit. The feast bowl passed from hand to hand as each family contributed to the ceremonial first course, their additions creating a mixture that represented the entire community's contribution to their shared prosperity. When it returned to Astrid, full and fragrant, she felt tears gathering in her eyes, not from pregnancy emotions, but from the profound recognition that she truly belonged here. To the harvest, she said, raising the bowl toward the assembled crowd, and to the community that has become our family. The answering cheer filled their hall with warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. Everything to do with the bonds of acceptance and mutual respect that had finally, fully embraced them both. The baby's first blanket lay folded beside the bed, woven from wool of their own sheep and dyed with colors from Astrid's herb garden. She had spent the final weeks of pregnancy completing the soft fabric, her fingers working the familiar patterns even as labor pains grew stronger and more frequent. The blanket represented everything their life together had become, practical yet beautiful, made with love and skill, carrying forward traditions while creating new ones. The pains are closer now, Astrid told Bjorn, as another contraction gripped her body. Dawn was breaking outside their windows, painting the world in soft pastels that promised a clear, cold day. I think our child is ready to join us. Bjorn had been awake all night, pacing between the bed and the fire, alternately comforting his wife and trying to manage his own anxiety about the birth. He'd lost Ingrid to fever, and though Astrid's pregnancy had progressed smoothly, the fear of losing someone else he loved haunted the edges of his consciousness. "Should I send for Ragnhild?" he asked, referring to the village's primary midwife. The older woman had attended dozens of births and commanded respect for her skill and experience. "Not yet," Astrid replied, gripping his hand as another wave of pain crested and receded. But soon, when the pains come so close, I can't speak through them. As the morning progressed, their small hall filled with the quiet intensity of approaching birth. Astrid moved restlessly, finding comfort in different positions, while Bjorn prepared the supplies they would need: clean linens, heated water. The special herbs Astrid had prepared for easing labor and preventing infection. "Tell me about the blanket," Bjorn said during a lull between contractions, needing distraction from his worry and knowing she found comfort in discussing her careful preparations. "The blue comes from woad I grew myself," she said, running her fingers over the soft wool. "The yellow from wildflowers we gathered last summer. And the white is natural wool from Brunhilde, remember her? The ewe who always tries to escape the pasture." "I remember. She'll probably try to claim credit for helping with the baby's first covering." Their gentle laughter was interrupted by a contraction so strong that Astrid couldn't speak, could only breathe through it while gripping Bjorn's hands. When it passed, they both knew the time for casual conversation had ended. "Ragnhild," Astrid gasped. "Please." Bjorn ran to the village faster than he'd moved since his warrior days, returning within an hour with the midwife and Kari, who had insisted on coming to help. The hall transformed into a birth chamber, filled with purposeful activity and the ancient rhythms of women's work. "Everything looks good," Ragnhild announced after examining Astrid. "The baby is positioned properly, and your body is doing exactly what it should. This little one just needs time to make the journey." The hours that followed blurred together in a haze of pain, effort, and anticipation. Astrid drew strength from the blanket she'd woven, from Bjorn's steady presence, from the knowledge that their child would be born into a home filled with love and community support. As afternoon shadows grew long, the baby finally arrived, a daughter with dark hair like her mother's and lungs that announced her displeasure with the cold world outside the womb. Ragnhild cleaned her quickly and wrapped her in the first blanket, the soft wool immediately soothing the newborn's cries. "She's perfect," Bjorn whispered, accepting his daughter with hands that trembled from emotion rather than fear. "Absolutely perfect, Inga," Astrid said softly, reaching to touch the tiny fingers that emerged from the blanket's folds. Inga Bjornsdottir. As evening fell and their visitors departed, the new family settled into the peaceful intimacy of their first night together. Little Inga nursed contentedly, wrapped in her mother's handiwork, while her parents marveled at the perfection of tiny fingers and toes, the delicate shell of each ear, the way she seemed to focus on their faces, even in the dim firelight. "Look what we've made," Astrid murmured, adjusting the blanket around their daughter. Not just her, but everything. This home, this life, this feeling of belonging somewhere. "From the worst day of your life to the best," Bjorn observed, settling more comfortably beside his wife and daughter. "Not the worst to the best," Astrid corrected gently. "The necessary to the beautiful. If Eric hadn't abandoned me, I never would have found you. Sometimes what looks like ending is really beginning." The baby's first blanket wrapped around all three of them as they dozed beside the fire, its soft wool bearing the colors of their shared garden, the labor of Astrid's hands, and the promise of many more blankets to come, for this child, for the siblings who might follow, for the grandchildren who would carry their love forward into futures they could only imagine. Outside, snow began to fall softly, but inside their hall, warmth and love created a sanctuary that would shelter their family through whatever seasons lay ahead.